sunrise, the ground began to shake beneath the old farmer's ranch. His wife froze at the window as hundreds of Apache riders appeared through the dust, silent, armed, and moving straight toward their home. Just 3 days earlier, the farmer had found a wounded Apache boy alone in the desert, barely alive. The townspeople warned him not to get involved. "Leave the boy," they said, "or you'll bring trouble to your doorstep." But the farmer ignored them. He carried the child home, treated his wounds, and protected him like family.
No.
800 Apache warriors had arrived at dawn. The farmer stepped outside, believing this could be the final moment of his life. But when the Apache chief rode forward and looked at the young boy standing beside him, everything changed in a way nobody on that ranch would ever forget. The Arizona desert was quiet that afternoon. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The kind that made a man uneasy. Elias Turner guided his old wagon along a narrow dirt trail that cut through miles of dry land. Heat rose from the ground in slow waves. Dust clung to his boots, his hat, even his eyelashes. The old farmer wiped sweat from his face and looked toward the distant hills. Nothing moved. No birds. No riders. Only wind. Elias had traveled this route for nearly 20 years. He knew every rock, every cactus, every dry creek bed hidden beneath the sand. The desert could be beautiful, but it could also turn cruel without warning. People disappeared out here. Sometimes they were never found again. A rifle rested beside him on the wagon seat. These lands had grown dangerous over the past few years. Ranchers spoke constantly about raids, stolen horses, and attacks near the frontier. Fear had spread through every small town in the territory. Most settlers blamed the Apache. Elias was not so certain. He had seen desperate men do terrible things on both sides. The old wagon creaked as it rolled over uneven ground. Elias pulled gently on the reins when something caught his eye near a cluster of rocks ahead. At first he thought it was a blanket tossed into the sand. Then it moved. The horse snorted nervously. Elias stopped the wagon at once. His hand moved toward the rifle, but he did not pick it up. Slowly, carefully, he climbed down from the wagon and stepped closer. A child lay half buried in the dust. The boy looked no older than 10 years old. His dark hair was matted with sweat. Dirt covered his face and clothes. One leg was wrapped tightly with torn cloth stained deep red with blood. The child opened his eyes for only a second. Fear filled them instantly. He tried to crawl backward, but pain stopped him almost immediately. Elias noticed the torn Apache clothing on the boy's shoulder. The old farmer looked around quickly. The desert remained silent. No riders. No signs of anyone nearby. Still, his heart beat harder. An Apache child alone in the desert could mean trouble. If warriors came searching for the boy and found him at the ranch, there could be danger for everyone living there. Elias knew exactly what people in town would tell him to do. Leave the boy. Walk away. Forget he was ever there. The child stared at him like a frightened animal waiting for death. Elias slowly removed his hat and knelt beside him. "You are hurt," he said quietly. The boy said nothing. His breathing sounded weak and uneven. Elias carefully examined the wound on the child's leg. The cut was deep. Infection had already started spreading around it. Without help, the boy would not survive much longer. The farmer sighed heavily. For a long moment he simply looked toward the horizon. Then back at the child. "What is your name?" Elias asked. The boy swallowed painfully. "Dakota." Elias nodded once. "Well, Dakota, you are not dying out here today." The child looked confused. Maybe even shocked. Slowly, Elias slid one arm beneath the boy's shoulders and another beneath his legs. Dakota tensed immediately, but he was too weak to resist. The old farmer carried him carefully to the wagon. Every step felt heavier than the last. Not because of the child. Because Elias understood the choice he was making. Once he brought the boy home, nothing would remain simple. People would talk. Some would threaten him. Others would accuse him of helping the enemy. But none of that mattered right now. The child needed help. Elias placed Dakota gently inside the wagon and covered him with a spare blanket. The boy watched him closely, still unsure whether he could trust this stranger. Elias climbed back onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins. "You rest," he said softly. The wagon began rolling toward the Turner Ranch. As the sun lowered across the desert sky, neither of them realized that one small act of kindness was about to change the lives of everyone in the valley forever. The Turner Ranch sat far from town, surrounded by dry fields and open desert. By the time Elias reached home, the sun had almost disappeared behind the hills. The wooden porch creaked as Martha Turner stepped outside carrying a lantern. She smiled at first when she saw her husband returning. Then she noticed the child in the wagon. Her face changed immediately. "Elias," she whispered. The old farmer climbed down slowly. "He was alone in the desert," he said. Martha moved closer and carefully lifted the lantern. The warm light revealed Dakota's injured leg and bruised face. Then she saw the Apache clothing. Fear flashed across her eyes. "You brought him here? He would have died out there." Martha looked toward the dark horizon as if she expected riders to appear at any second. "Does anyone know?" "I do not think so." But even as Elias spoke those words, deep down he was not certain. Martha stayed silent for a long moment. Finally she stepped aside and opened the front door. "Bring him in before the night gets colder." Inside the farmhouse, Martha cleaned the boy's wounds while Elias sat nearby in an old wooden chair. Dakota barely spoke. He watched every movement carefully, like someone waiting for danger. The cut on his leg looked worse under the lantern light. "He has fever," Martha said softly. Elias nodded. Dakota winced as Martha wrapped fresh cloth around the wound. "You are safe here," she told him gently. The boy looked uncertain. Maybe he had heard stories about settlers the same way settlers heard stories about Apache warriors. Fear lived on both sides of the frontier. Later that night, Dakota finally spoke again. "My father looking for me," he said quietly. Elias leaned forward. "Where were you heading?" The child lowered his eyes. "There was fighting near Canyon. Horses ran. Horses ran. I got lost." After that, he said nothing more. The house became quiet except for the sound of wind outside. But the peace did not last long. The next morning, Elias rode into town for supplies. The moment he stepped inside the general store, conversation stopped. Every man in the room looked at him. Sheriff Boone stood near the counter with his arms crossed. "So it is true," the sheriff said. Elias frowned. "What is true?" "You brought an Apache boy to your ranch." The old farmer realized immediately that someone had seen him in the desert. A man near the window spat into the dirt. "You trying to get us all killed, Turner?" Another stepped forward angrily. "What happens when warriors come looking for him?" Elias remained calm. "He is a child. He needed help." "He is Apache," the man snapped. The store filled with nervous murmurs. Elias slowly looked around the room. "I did not know kindness had become a crime." Nobody answered. Sheriff Boone sighed heavily and walked closer. "People are scared," he said quietly. "There has been too much trouble lately." Elias picked up a sack of supplies from the counter. "Fear makes people stupid." One rancher slammed his fist onto a table. "And trusting Apaches makes people dead." The room grew tense instantly. For a second Elias thought the man might reach for his gun. Instead the farmer stepped closer until they stood face to face. "If anybody comes near that boy," Elias said calmly, "they answer to me first." Silence filled the store. Even Sheriff Boone looked uneasy. Elias turned and walked outside without another word. But as he mounted his horse, he noticed several men watching him carefully from across the street. And for the first time since finding Dakota, the old farmer began to wonder if the real danger was not coming from the desert at all. 3 days passed slowly at the Turner Ranch. Dakota's fever finally began to fade. The swelling in his leg went down, and little by little the boy regained his strength. He helped Martha carry water from the well and followed Elias around the fields, asking quiet questions about farming tools and horses. For the first time since arriving, he even smiled. But outside the ranch, fear continued growing. Each night, Elias noticed riders stopping near the edge of his land. They never crossed the fence. They simply watched from a distance before disappearing into the darkness again. Town settlers. waiting, watching, judging. Martha noticed it too. "This cannot continue forever," she whispered one evening. Elias stared into the fire. "I know." Dakota sat silently nearby, pretending not to hear. But he understood more than they realized. That same night, the boy woke suddenly from another nightmare. Elias heard him breathing hard from the next room and walked quietly to the doorway. Dakota sat upright in bed, sweat covering his face. "They coming," the child whispered. "Who?" "My people." Elias leaned against the doorframe. "You think they are close?" Dakota nodded slowly. "My father never stops searching." The old farmer looked toward the dark window. Something uneasy settled deep inside him. Before sunrise the next morning, the ranch dogs began barking wildly. Elias opened his eyes immediately. Then he heard it. A distant rumbling sound. Low, heavy, like thunder rolling across dry earth. Martha rushed to the window. Her face turned pale instantly. "Elias!" The old farmer grabbed his rifle and stepped outside onto the porch. The sight before him stopped him cold. Dust clouds stretched across the eastern horizon. Shapes moved within them. Riders. Hundreds of them. Apache warriors. The rising sun slowly revealed more and more horses appearing through the dust until the entire valley seemed covered with riders. Dakota stepped outside behind Elias. The boy froze. His lips parted slightly. Then he whispered one word. "Father." By the time dawn fully arrived, nearly 800 Apache warriors surrounded the ranch from every direction. Some carried rifles across their backs. Others held bows and long spears. Their horses moved nervously beneath them as silence filled the valley. No one attacked. No one spoke. That silence felt heavier than gunfire. Martha stood near the doorway, clutching a shotgun with trembling hands. Elias remained still. At the front of the massive group sat a single older warrior on a black horse. Feathers moved gently behind him in the morning wind. His face carried deep scars and calm, steady eyes. The Apache chief. Dakota suddenly stepped forward. The chief saw him instantly. For the first time, emotion broke across the older man's face. Relief. The chief raised one hand slowly. At once, every Apache warrior lowered their weapons. Then the chief climbed down from his horse and walked toward the ranch alone. Dakota ran to him without hesitation. The two embraced tightly in the middle of the yard. Elias watched quietly as the chief placed both hands on the boy's face, speaking softly in Apache words he could not understand. Then the older warrior turned toward Elias. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. The desert wind moved between them. Finally, the chief stepped forward and placed a closed fist against his chest. "You saved my son," he said in careful English. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle for a moment, then slowly lowered it. "He needed help," the farmer answered. The Apache chief nodded once. "But now," he said quietly, glancing toward the distant hills, "others are coming too." Elias frowned as the Apache chief looked toward the western hills. At first, he heard nothing. Then came the sound of fast-moving horses. A second group of riders appeared through the dust. Town settlers. Armed. Sheriff Boone rode at the front beside several nervous ranchers holding rifles tightly in their hands. The moment they saw hundreds of Apache warriors surrounding the Turner Ranch, panic spread across their faces. One rider cursed under his breath. Another lifted his rifle immediately. "Do not shoot," Sheriff Boone shouted. But fear had already taken hold. The settlers believed they were arriving to stop an attack. Instead, they had ridden straight into the middle of something far more dangerous. Apache warriors shifted on their horses. Several reached for weapons. The air suddenly felt tight and heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Dakota stepped closer to his father. Martha stood frozen near the porch. Elias could feel disaster building all around him. One gunshot would destroy everything. A frightened rancher raised his rifle toward the Apache lines. "They got the ranch surrounded," he yelled. Another man shouted, "We should fire before they do." "No," Elias barked. But the men barely listened. Fear was louder than reason. The Apache chief turned slowly toward his warriors. His face hardened. Elias could see the tension spreading through the riders behind him. They were ready to fight if necessary. And there were hundreds of them. Sheriff Boone rode forward carefully, sweat running down his face. "Elias," he called out nervously, "move away from them." The old farmer did not move. Instead, he stepped directly into the open space between both groups. Alone. The settlers stared at him in disbelief. Apache warriors watched silently from horseback. Elias raised both empty hands. "This ends now," he shouted. Nobody moved. The old farmer turned toward the settlers first. "They did not come here for war," he said. "They came for the boy." Some of the ranchers looked uncertain. Others still gripped their rifles tightly. One angry man pointed toward the Apache warriors. "You trust them?" Elias looked directly at him. "I trust a father searching for his son." Silence spread across the valley. Then Elias turned toward the Apache chief. "And these people are scared," he said calmly. "Scared people make foolish choices." The chief studied him carefully. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then Dakota slowly walked forward into the middle of the open ground beside Elias. The child looked toward the settlers. "I was dying," he said softly. "Farmer saved me." The simple words hit harder than any speech. Several settlers lowered their eyes. Sheriff Boone removed his hat slowly. The Apache chief finally raised one hand toward his warriors. At once, weapons lowered again. A deep breath seemed to pass through the entire valley. The danger had not disappeared. But the killing had stopped before it began. Sheriff Boone climbed down from his horse and approached Elias carefully. "You really stood between two armies," he muttered quietly. Elias gave a tired smile. "Someone had to." The sheriff looked toward the Apache chief, then back toward the settlers. For the first time that morning, people on both sides truly saw each other not as enemies, but as fathers, families, and human beings trying to survive the same hard land. And somehow, that changed everything. The Apache warriors remained near the ranch only a short time after the tension faded. No battle came. No blood was spilled. Instead, something far more unusual happened. The Apache chief sat with Elias Turner beneath the shade of an old tree while Martha brought water and fresh bread from the house. Sheriff Boone stood nearby, still unable to believe how close the valley had come to disaster. Dakota stayed close to Elias the entire morning. The boy no longer looked frightened. Before leaving, the Apache chief stepped toward the old farmer once more. "My son lives because of you," he said quietly. "My people will remember this." Elias nodded. "I only did what was right." The chief studied him for a moment. "Most men speak about courage," he replied. "Very few choose it." Then he removed a small carved stone necklace from his own wrist and handed it to Elias. "A sign of respect," he said. The old farmer accepted it carefully. As the sun climbed higher, the Apache riders finally began turning their horses toward the open desert. Hundreds of warriors moved across the valley like a great shadow drifting into the horizon. Dakota looked back one last time before riding away beside his father. He smiled at Elias. Then they were gone. For a long while, nobody at the ranch spoke. Only wind moved through the dry grass. Sheriff Boone finally broke the silence. "People in town will never believe this story." Elias gave a small laugh. "They do not have to. But they did believe it." Because word spread quickly across the frontier about the farmer who saved an Apache child and stopped a war before it started. Years later, people still spoke about that morning at dawn when 800 Apache warriors surrounded a lonely ranch. And how one simple act of kindness changed the desert forever. And so the desert kept its silence, but it never forgot what happened at the Turner Ranch. A single choice in a moment of fear became a story passed from one town to another, from one generation to the next. Some called it luck. Others called it madness. But those who were there knew it was neither. It was a farmer who refused to turn away from a child in need. And in doing so, he stopped a war before it could begin. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on it. Because sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change everything that follows. Tell us in the comments what you would have done in Elias's place. And if you want more powerful frontier stories like this, Make sure to like the video and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Until next time, stay safe and keep your heart open, even when the world tells you not to.